The emergency transmission did not follow the usual diplomatic protocols, nor did it arrive through the designated corridors of communication. It tore straight through Terran firewall satellites and quantum relay stations like a screaming dagger, made of static and desperation, crashing into the secure war room of the United Terran Strategic Command aboard the Solar Bastion with such priority clearance that it forced a system override from the very top layers of the Terran high chain, a privilege granted only to pre-approved allies, none of whom belonged to the Zelvar Concord. The room where it landed was made of tungsten core plating and silence, a soundproof dome floating inside the military citadel's heart, known to outsiders only as Sector Zero Void, where conversations were classified before they were even spoken, where projections of entire solar conflicts were drawn and erased in the breath between pulses, where 5 individuals sat immovable, unimpressed, and unblinking in the face of wars no one else ever knew had happened at the head of the table. Sat Fleet Marshal Anara Vale, a woman forged in Earth's last oil war, the one who led the Terran exodus from the Saturn Belt after the ice mines collapsed, her gaze steel-rigid and unsentimental, her voice known for ending more debates than missiles ever did. The only living person authorized to mobilize full-spectrum Terran fleet deployment without parliamentary approval to her right, Admiral Cato Mero, Chief of Terran Naval Intelligence, spoke rarely, but when he did, people recalculated their decisions in silence, a tactician known not for the battles he won, but for the ones he prevented by placing fleets in the right shadow before the enemy even considered a move beside him. Dr. Elian Kaur, head of Terran's Psychology Division, leaned forward with the precise calm of someone who studied war not in formations or engines, but in neural hesitation, in alien motives mapped across cultures so ancient even their creators had forgotten the reasons they began to fight. Voice that arrived on the room's central holographic disc belonged to Supreme Overseer Varnolth, a Zelvarian elder who once declared humanity a race of primates playing with matches in a galaxy full of fuel. And though the sound was digitally cleaned and stripped of distortions, there was a tremor beneath the syllables, a stutter not caused by translation algorithms, but by something far older fear. I speak, Varnolth said, his tritonal voice glitching in and out of harmony, not as ruler of the Concord, but as its last surviving witness. I speak to the Terran Command not in arrogance, but in acknowledgement of a misjudgment that may cost us all our sons. The Dressari swarm has reached the core line. Our fleets disintegrate before them. Our planetary shields rupture like bone in the mouth of fire, and our logic fails before their consumption. We who once named ourselves preservers of order are undone. And so we come to you, Terrans, to ask for what we denied you once, your intervention. The silence that followed was not the absence of sound, but its suffocation, as though the galaxy itself held its breath while the most underestimated species in interstellar memory absorbed the moment Anara Vale did not respond immediately. She stood from the steel-bonded chair, walked slowly to the projection disc, and examined the waveform of the transmission with the gaze of a biologist, studying the remains of a virus that had escaped its own lab. Then she turned to the others and spoke with deliberate gravity. They didn't ask for help, she said. They surrendered their pride. Cato Mero tapped a command into his console, bringing up classified footage recovered from fringe drones near the Zelvar border, and what appeared there was unlike any previous Drexori engagement. They had modeled titanic biomechanical hives blotting out stars, rewriting the terrain of moons with fractal limbs, a silent spread of intelligence so alien it refused to be understood. Kaur's voice was the only one that carried curiosity instead of judgment. These aren't drones acting on command. These are autonomous swarms evolving in response to conflict. We're no longer dealing with a protocol-driven enemy. The Drexari have reached recursive self-design. They don't conquer, they overwrite. Vale folded her arms and stared at the transmission. still flickering in the air like a dying star. Then she nodded once. Deploy Strategic Command Alpha to the Helios Gate. Initiate Project Iron Echo. Begin. Forward observation of Zelvar collapse points. Prepare Task Force Leviathan for immediate silent mobilization. No public broadcasts, no diplomatic confirmations. We go unseen, but are we committing? Kato asked, his voice unreadable. We're not committing to a war, Vale replied. We're preparing to teach one. And with that, the first motion of the war began not with the launch of a ship or the crack of a rifle, but with a single command that left Earth and did not echo back, vanishing into the cold vacuum between galaxies, where silence was never empty. Only waiting, the first Zelvarian warcruiser that arrived in Terran space was not escorted, not armored, and not proud. Its surface was scarred with scorched memory plates where its fleet insignias had once pulsed. Its energy signature was ragged and flickering like a dying beacon, and it drifted through the Helios Gate in silence, trailed not by triumph, but by failure that had taken physical form. It was received without ceremony on Echelon 5, a Terran military dry dock orbiting a dead star, a place designed not for diplomacy but for containment. Yet the vessel's pilot requested no hospitality, only contact. And when the ship's hatch opened with a slow hiss of fatigued hydraulics, what stepped out was not the Zelvar that Terrans remembered. Commander Relveth, once a tactician who'd publicly dismissed human intelligence reports as emotional paranoia dressed as protocol, now walked with a limp reinforced by a mechanical brace, his lower left arm replaced with a grafted construct fused mid-battle. His eyes, once gleaming gold, were clouded with the disorientation of someone who had seen their assumptions starve to death. He stood before Commander Tariq Idris, appointed Field Director of Operation Iron Echo, a man whose reputation was less carved in metals and more whispered in training chambers and war rooms. The architect of the Jupiter Arc siege, the man who forced a coalition of warring asteroid clans into unified surrender using only misinformation, orbital sound waves, and the illusion of a weapon that didn't even exist. Tariq Idris didn't shake hands, didn't salute. He simply looked at Relveth as one might look at a shattered prototype and said, "You're late." Relveth didn't argue. He simply lowered his head and replied, "The Drexari erased our schedules." They were escorted into the Tactical Cortex, a chamber designed for deep conflict scenario mapping, its walls lined with recursive holomaps that adjusted to real-time galactic conditions. And as Relveth loaded the battlefield data extracted from the last Zelvar engagements, the room's light dimmed beneath the weight of projected extinction, entire sectors gone dark, dozens of species unresponsive, code fracture anomalies spreading like viruses across defense satellites. Entire star systems were organic and synthetic. Matter had fused into incomprehensible hive masses, formations that no longer moved in conventional assault patterns, but responded to intent, adapting before contact, evolving before detection. Idris examined the data without flinching, then turned to his aides and spoke as if he were reviewing a weather report. Marked their formation density at 74%. Exponential cohesion, preemptive adaptation models confirmed Drexari quantum signaling exceeds Zelvar decryption capacity. And their core formations show signs of recursive intelligence loops. This is no longer an invasion. It's an environmental rewrite. They are reformatting the galaxy's physics through biomechanical influence. Relveth's voice cracked for the first time. They don't conquer planets, Commander. They replace them, to which Idris replied, "Then we won't defend yours. We'll overwrite them back within hours." Phase 1 of Iron Echo was launched containment through disruption and invisible deployment of Terran assets already stationed near the Zelvar frontier, including stealth platforms, logic virus relay towers, and silent choir units drone. Swarms designed to intercept Drexari signal code and rebound false neural commands to confuse the hive's internal hierarchy. Relveth protested. That won't stop the hives. We need walls, fortresses, shielding patterns. We need presence. But Idris only raised one brow and answered calmly. That's why you lost. Because humans had never believed in permanence, had never relied on monuments or honor lines or bastion fleets that announced their presence across solar miles. They had built their war doctrine not on resistance, but adaptation. The same trait that made the Dressari formidable now made humanity the only species capable of standing against them as the Terran fleets moved like whispers across black voids. By passing traditional jump points and embedding deep into broken systems, the galaxy began to change shape, not in light, but in behavior. Dressari pulses slowed. Drone coordination fragmented. Entire swarms turning mid-assault toward Phantom. Signals that led them into uncharted gravitational traps. The first major strike was executed under Stellar Silence Protocol, a human tactic wherein no physical ship made contact. Only decoy constructs loaded with compressed black matter detonations, cloaked in neutrino shells, arriving by shadow transit and targeting Dressari thought nodes directly, severing swarm communication so surgically that the Dressari failed to realize they'd lost the battle until it was already history. On the Zelvar capital world of Tervathken, the footage played live across their surviving council chambers, showing Dressari hive ships collapsing inward, not in fire, but in confusion, their own drones turning against each other in a panic state. Induced by Terran mimetic feedback fields, when asked what this tactic was called, Idris offered only one name. We call it uncertainty. That day, for the first time since the war had begun, the Dressari retreated not because they were defeated, but because they no longer understood the rules of engagement, and in the war rooms buried deep in the hearts of shattered worlds, alien generals whispered the name of a species they had once dismissed as undisciplined, sentimental, primitive. Now whispered it with caution. Humans, the first Dressari. Intelligence fracture was recorded not in a battlefield log or intercepted signal, but in the sudden silence of Sector W13, where a Dressari spire fleet vanished mid-course during what should have been a coordinated strike. No debris, no plasma echoes, only the static imprint of a Terran incursion that left nothing alive but questions. By the time the Zelvar attempted to investigate, they found only a trail of artificial quantum distortions, residual aftershock from Terran phase drift engines, and a debris field scattered with pieces too small to identify. And when Zelvar analysts reviewed the flight paths, they discovered the most terrifying detail. The Dressari fleet had turned on itself in perfect formation, disassembling without chaos. Like a machine executing an internal command, the operation was executed by Terran Strike Division Echo 9, an autonomous fleet composed entirely of AI-controlled vessels piloted by neural imprint proxies of human commanders, and led by the warship TSV Obsidian Wraith, a vessel never officially recorded in any public Terran registry, coated in spectrally adaptive armor and powered by a gravitational filament drive that rendered it undetectable unless it chose to be. Its mission profile was designed by Director Reese Halden, Chief of Terran Strategic Warfare Simulation, a man whose consciousness had been partially uploaded into the Econet to reduce response latency between command and execution, and whose human body now resided in deep cryo, not out of necessity, but to keep his thinking uninterrupted by emotion. He had calculated the optimal engagement parameters, coordinated with the Sub-Quantum Warfare Division, and approved Protocol G77, Memory Injection Maneuver, a classified tactic wherein fragmented human war memories, harvested from soldiers across centuries, were weaponized and transmitted into the Dressari hive logic, forcing recursive conflict simulations inside the alien swarm's collective thought web. Within minutes of the protocol activation, the Dressari began to fracture. Atarik Idris watched the results from Command Relay Citadel Echelon Vanta, a Terran Black station positioned on the edge of Zelvarian space. And as the simulations unfolded, he noticed the change even before the data confirmed it. The Drexari were hesitating. Not tactically, but cognitively. Their movements no longer efficient. Their formations jittered with unpredictable lags. Their logic processors spiked into chaotic oscillations. Ralph stood beside him, staring in disbelief. You infected them with thoughts. Idris didn't blink as he responded. We taught them fear by making them remember a pain they never lived. The Zelvar couldn't comprehend it, not fully the idea of using memories as weapons, of injecting irrational human trauma into an enemy designed for perfect logic. But the Drexari had interfaced with thousands of species before and never encountered one whose survival depended not on superiority, but resilience. And that difference now poisoned their algorithms like a virus that couldn't be purged. Meanwhile, on the fringe worlds of the Zelvar frontier, human auxiliary teams established echo nodes, hidden relay structures buried beneath. Dead moons, coated in quantum-silent alloys and embedded with long-range command proxies, each operated by only 2 to 3 Terran engineers, each equipped with zero-body defense units, automated defense systems that activated on thought signature. Breach one such unit, Echo Node 3RA, located on the decaying shell of Moon Tessel 8, had not heard from Drexari scouts in days. Yet its motionless crew of 3 remained alert, checking pulse resonance, warping field predictions, and probabilistic incursion forecasts, because humans didn't rely on visual markers or light speed signals. They predicted enemy arrival through behavioral echo deviation, a system that measured microshifts in Drexari gravitational patterns, and when the attack came, it didn't come with a fleet or a bombardment. It came with silence and a glitch, half a second where time appeared to stutter, and then the Drexari arrived through a folded slit, emerging not into space, but directly into the Echo Node's atmosphere. Expecting the shock of surprise to carry the advantage, they were wrong. The Drexari were shredded before they even registered the environmental phase, torn apart by automated severance arrays, human defense systems that function not by firing projectiles, but by collapsing the space between attacker and shield into non-existence, severing molecular continuity with no sound and no trace Terran. Command didn't celebrate the victory. They logged it, studied it, and adjusted the variables to ensure greater efficiency for the next encounter. Because for humans, the war wasn't about vengeance or retribution. It was about learning faster than the enemy evolved, but the true shift came not from the battlefields, but from the data collected by Echo AI Protocol 6 Delta, which analyzed Drexari response patterns and discovered something terrifying. The swarm was now building simulations of human behavior within its own network, using harvested battle footage to predict human actions, not by logic, but by mimicking unpredictability. When Dr. Elian Kaur received the findings, her face paled for the first time since the war began, and she brought the analysis directly to Anara Vale without delay. They've started dreaming. Marshall, she said. They've begun constructing synthetic thought anomalies based on human irrationality. They're trying to imitate what they fear most. To which Vale responded, with solemn gravity, then the only way to win now is to become more irrational than we've ever been. And across the Terran war map, a new protocol was activated, Iron Variant, Asymmetric Convergence, a strategic directive built not on probability, but chaos theory, allowing select human fleets to operate without oversight, without pattern, without warning. Because in this war, survival would not belong to the most powerful or the most ancient. It will belong to those who understood that logic has limits and madness, when guided by discipline, becomes evolution. The first time the Zelvar witnessed Terran ground command in action, they mistook it for disorder. It was on the broken world of Drelshire, a Mayan colony evacuated during the early Drexari advance, where the swarm had established a subhive beneath the planet's crust, building network spires that disrupted quantum communication across 4 systems, and every Zelvar attempt to reclaim it had failed catastrophically. Their fleets reduced to metal slag and memory fragments before even breaching the atmosphere. They had expected the humans to arrive with overwhelming force. Coordinated fleets, pulse cannons, planetary shields, a show of empire-scale strength. But when the Terran response came, it consisted of only 3 vessels, a command frigate, a drop scout, and a logistics node that didn't even carry weapons. Relvith stood in silent disbelief aboard the orbiting Zelvar carrier, watching the tiny human craft descend into the gravity. While as if they were mocking the very notion of defense, his voice thick with restrained judgment as he muttered, "They send reconnaissance teams to die." Tarek Idris, standing beside him without breaking gaze from the command display, replied calmly, "We don't die in reconnaissance, we listen." The ground teams were composed of adaptive warfare units, small squads of cybernetically enhanced humans trained, not to control the battlefield, but to read it like a language. Each soldier carrying a microfusion blade, an omnicloak, and most importantly, a cognitive resonance array wired directly to the neural battlefield simulation model in orbit. While the Zelvar had always used war as a demonstration of strength, the Terrans approached it as a puzzle, a system of behavior to be mapped, destabilized, and redefined. And within 40 minutes of landing, they had pinpointed the Drexuri subhive location by measuring inconsistencies in magnetic decay rates, something the Zelvar scanners had dismissed as environmental interference by the 3rd hour. Human operatives were deploying variable entropy mines, weapons that didn't detonate by proximity or impact, but by uncertainty, each mine triggering only when enemy decision probability rose above 87%, meaning Drexari drones were destroyed the moment they committed to a single action in the orbiting command chamber. Relvith watched as Drexari formations began to falter, their swarm coordination degrading not from direct damage, but from hesitation. Their internal consensus algorithms breaking down under the pressure of unpredictability. "They're splitting," he said in disbelief. "They're unsure which path is safe." To which Idris responded, "No path is safe when your opponent fights like a question that changes every time you try to answer it." In the 5th hour, without any grand assault or dramatic strike, the entire Drexari subhive collapsed, its core node infected by a Terran software construct known only as Phantom Coil, a digital mimic of Drexari command structure designed to give false orders directly into the swarm's network, essentially turning their hive mind into a hallucination of itself. When the final detonation echoed beneath Drelsha's crust, leveling the hive and sealing the chasm, the planet went silent. No casualties, no cities burned, no power lost. The Zelvar officers tried to understand, tried to map the sequence of actions onto their own doctrines, but the math didn't work. The tactics were asymmetrical, the victory impossible to explain using the structured logic of their command academies. Later, in a private conference aboard Solar Bastion, Relvith confronted Idris directly. "We trained for centuries in symphonic warfare, for elegant flanking maneuvers in gravity well captures. And your people scramble chaos like it's a language. You send small squads into mathematically suicidal zones and somehow extract control. How do you teach war like this?" Tarek Idris turned slowly, his expression unchanged, his voice unembellished. "You don't teach it," he said. "You survive long enough that it becomes instinct, and then you pass the instinct forward, not as tradition, but as a warning in response to Terran results." Zelvar High Command finally agreed to implement a controversial program integration protocol Delta, a temporary merging of Terran and Zelvar forces on strategic fronts, with human commanders granted full operational authority over joint operations. The first training simulations where Brutalk Zelvar soldiers were shocked at the lack of ceremonial order, the absence of hierarchy-bound protocol, The Terran preference for lateral thinking and scenario improvisation over pre-planned sequences, and many resisted, considering the humans barbaric, even irrational. But after 27 consecutive training defeats, followed by the first successful joint repulsion of a Drexari cluster fleet using Echo Shadow Mirage formations, a Mihaj Terran tactic that simulated fleet collapses to lure Drexari vessels into blind jumps, they began to change. The Zelvar didn't admire the humans. They didn't even fully understand them, but they began to follow not because they trusted humanity, but because, for the first time in generations, someone had broken the pattern of extinction across 4 bases. Terran instructors began rewriting combat protocols, embedding synthetic logic viruses into Zelvar neural HUDs, teaching them to fight like ghosts, rather than soldiers, to calculate not in vectors, but in chaos elasticity, and to discard the arrogance of tradition in favor of the utility of survival. Every soldier was taught a singular directive: predict nothing, prepare for everything, strike where logic ends. And in the silence of war-torn systems, amid the debris of Drexari vessels that now tore themselves apart from within, the echo of a new kind of warfare spread like fire through a drought-starved forest. This was no longer about defense. It was not about preserving order. It was the art of calculated resistance, the kind humans had been mastering since their skies first caught fire. Black Hollow was not marked on any galactic star chart. Not because it was hidden, but because it wanted to be found, located at the ragged edge of Terran space, beyond the gravitational anomaly known as the Vespertire. It orbited a collapsed red star inside a dead system that emitted no stable light, only scattered fragments of gamma radiation and debris, clouds circling like ash around an ancient battlefield, whose memory had been devoured by entropy. It was never intended to be a city, nor a bastion, nor even a defense node. It was a trap constructed centuries prior under directive night glass. Black Hollow had been envisioned as a silent contingency, a facility that looked abandoned, felt abandoned, and leaked just enough detectable power fluctuation to attract the interest of anything curious enough to probe it. It was the only Terran station ever built without a primary reactor. Its energy was harvested from dark matter drift and weaponized background radiation. Its internal structure was a maze of false corridors, logic mazes, shifting magnetic fields, and hallucinatory architecture, designed to confuse even non-organic perception. It was a monument to one question: what if the bait was smarter than the predator? When the Drexari scouts first detected the signal pulses, they followed with cold efficiency, triangulating the instability, dispatching a probe fleet of 13 node harvesters, each with enough raw processing power to overwrite a planetary defense grid within hours. To them, Black Hollow appeared vulnerable, flickering, lightly defended. To humans, it was live ammunition dressed as a wound. Tarek Idris received the confirmation at Solar Bastion. He didn't issue any orders. He simply nodded once and said, "Open the gate." Black Hollow's outer layer, a dead crust of derelict plating and long deactivated turrets, collapsed inwards at exactly the moment the Drexari fleet reached orbital lock, revealing a second skin, a dynamic lattice of anti-phase mirror panels, each one programmed to reflect the Drexari's own signal intelligence back at them in recursive feedback loops. The effect was immediate. Drexari logic systems began to jitter and fragment. What they saw was no longer the Hollow. They were seeing themselves, attacking themselves, trapped in an illusion that updated faster than their adaptive logic could recalibrate. By the third minute, half the fleet was firing on its own phantom reflections. By the sixth, a command-class hive carrier began to split open at the hull, overloaded with false commands, hemorrhaging drones that spiraled in chaotic formation like insects trying to escape a thought at the core of the station. The Hollow protocol activated an ancient Terran construct, no larger than a civilian lifeboat, rose from beneath the command spire, Inside it was no AI, no weapons officer, no nervous young soldier praying for survival, only a relic from the early days of Earth's deep space expansion. A logic bomb so advanced it had been outlawed by every surviving Terran charter, preserved only in myth and threat code name. Tantalus Seed, it didn't explode, it didn't fire a beam, it didn't release gas or fire a nanotest, it simply broadcast a contradiction to the Drexari, built on recursive logic trees and hive consensus. The contradiction created an irreversible paradox. The enemy you are chasing is you, but you are not the enemy. It looped across command subroutines, hijacked identity hashes, and seeded self-doubt into every node of the Drexari swarmine that touched the signal. The reaction was cataclysmic. The Drexari didn't just retreat, they withdrew inward, folding their carriers back into quantum transit before the corruption spread to their deeper command strata. But it was too late for most. In under 15 minutes, 11 of the 13 Drexari ships were either destroyed or completely unresponsive. The remaining 2 scattered in opposite directions, one dragging behind it fragments of its own shredded hive as if fleeing from a memory it could no longer categorize. And as the silence settled again over the Black Hollow system, the Terran tracking operators didn't cheer. They didn't speak. They simply updated the report asterisk. Sector 93B. Hostile logic response neutralized Black Hollow status. Operational Drexari fleet. Designation. Witness class likelihood of return. 8%. When the Zelver learned what had happened, they were unable to believe it. No weapons, no fleet, no army. Just a place the enemy had chosen to attack and a reality they weren't prepared to survive. Relvath called it a nightmare machine. Idris called it efficient psychological fortification. Fleet Marshal Anara Vale simply said, they expected war. We gave them reflection. From that point onward, Drexari command clusters began to avoid Terran space, rerouting even major offensives around sectors that bore the mark of Terran presence, not out of fear, but uncertainty, because in human territory, the laws of engagement collapsed. The logic of war became unreliable, and the enemy could not calculate what could not be rationally predicted. And behind that curtain of unknowable warfare, humanity built asterisk. They built fast. They built deep. They built for the war that hadn't reached them yet, because Black Hollow was not the end of the line. It was just the first trap the Joint Command Center on Station Aegis Theta was meant to symbolize. Cooperation, unity forged under fire, and the promise of a coalition future, but inside its precious sealed chambers, beneath the calculated tone of military coordination and data exchange, ran a deep and widening fault line made not of dissent, but of difference. To the Zelvar, war was an orchestration formations crafted with beauty, logic, elegance, driven by council-approved ethics that had endured since the age of the sixth orbit, when conflict was first formalized under the laws of measured engagement. And even now, facing extinction, their commanders wore ceremonial steel threads, and their battle cruisers glowed with engraved record rings for every fallen soldier. To the humans, war was a system of collapse to be studied, manipulated, and broken from within. And where the Zelvar saw ceremony, the Terrans saw delay. Where the Zelvar clung to structured fleets and moral calculus, humans operated inflexible. Strike teams, swarm-independent units, black wall simulations, and kill chain protocols too abstract for their allies to follow. Tarek Idris stood in the main operations bay, reviewing orbital logistics with his command AI, his tone unchanged since the beginning, his strategy adapting faster than the maps could redraw. And as Relvath entered the room, silent yet visibly burdened, he did not bow, salute, or greet. He simply placed a data crystal on the table. We lost the Verith Armory sector, he said. 3 colonies, 5 orbital rings, and 500,000 citizens consumed. Your projections were off by 12 hours. The Drexari hit earlier than expected. Tarek didn't flinch. He took the data, plugged it in, watched the logs replay in silent horror plasma-streaked voids. Drexery harvest tendrils tearing atmosphere from habitat domes. Civilians caught mid-evacuation. Emergency jump gates imploding under pressure. He watched all of it. And then he erased the projection and issued a single command: activate Operation False Flesh in adjacent sectors. Deploy hollow sigils, triple-layer false data streams across all refugee movement vectors. And send word to Echo Strike 4 to prepare silent shard release on the enemy retreat path. Relvath looked at him, anger simmering below a surface of professional restraint. That's not a retaliation. It's a distortion field you'll make. Them think we've relocated a city we've already lost, and they'll chase an illusion into a dead system, wasting resources while we mourn ash in orbit. Tarek finally turned toward him, voice quiet, deliberate. This isn't about mourning. It's about momentum. We don't match the Drexery in force. We disorient their perception of victory until they begin questioning whether they ever won at all. Meanwhile, human psychological warfare units began deploying new forms of behavioral disruption agents, including synthetic dream code spores laced through captured Drexari data nodes designed not to destroy, but to confuse, inserting anomalies into the swarm mind, planting fabricated memories of Terran tactics that had never happened. Battles that never occurred, but which the Drexari began adapting against anyway, wasting adaptation cycles on false. Data Silver High Counselors began objecting. This is desecration of conflict. Commander, said General Vex Latali during a joint review, you're not fighting the enemy. You're rewriting the battlefield into something they no longer recognize. This is not honor. It's weaponized deception. And Idris replied without hesitation. Honor is a luxury you can afford when your enemy believes in it. Across the warfronts, Drexery began to shift strategy. They no longer attacked major installations directly. They probed, with partial fleets, testing the reactions not of defenses, but of data behavior, noticing which signals were real, which were artificial, which movements were human fingerprints in disguise. And it was working. The Drexari weren't evolving faster, they were evolving erratically, uncertain whether what they faced was a species or a ghost that had learned to walk like one. But the greatest shift came not in Terran territory, but on the Zelvar battlefront at Tervax 4, where a mixed unit of Zelvar elite and human Echo-Marines were dispatched to intercept the Drexari hive spike that had begun infecting local planetary systems elsewhere. Commander Leorin took charge of the frontal engagement. Human strike leader Juno Calyx requested deployment of Marish Protocol 27, a tactic that involved allowing the enemy to partially overrun the battlefield, then triggering an inverted perimeter lockdown that sealed the hive inside the zone rather. The Zelvar refused, called it reckless and insulting to the soldiers on the ground. The Drexari advanced. Faster than expected, Zelvar lines began to collapse. Juno didn't wait for orders. She initiated the protocol anyway. She sealed the entire battlefield inside a gravitational prism, locked her team in with the swarm, and detonated reverse pulse detonators, coded to target the Drexery's echo signatures. It worked. Hive collapse losses on the Zelvar side were minimal. Juno's squad extracted via phase rift pinpoint evac technology. The Zelvar didn't even know humanity had mastered when Leorin confronted her later, asking if she understood what insubordination she had committed. She only answered, I understood it better than the swarm that died trying to make sense of it. After Tervax 4, Terran units were no longer seen as support or reinforcements. They were operators, strategic architects, feared, respected, resented, but never again underestimated. And somewhere in the heart of Terran space, aboard a silent dreadnought buried inside a dead nebula, an old AI reactivated a protocol long kept buried under layers of encryption file. Unlocked. Leviathan protocol purpose. Offensive engagement doctrine status. Dormant flag. Now pending. Authorization because allies were growing uneasy. The swarm was learning again, and humanity was no longer simply defending others. It was preparing to end the war on its own terms. Before the war began, before the Zelvar Concord crumbled beneath the weight of a swarm they couldn't understand. Before humanity became an unpredictable force of strategic chaos, the galaxy had forgotten the origins of human warfare, and perhaps that was the most fatal miscalculation of all the Drexari. Swarm had traced its adaptive logic through the archives of over 900 civilizations. It cataloged victory in patterns, loss in miscalculations, and resistance as statistical delay. But it had never fought a species whose earliest wars were fought with stone and fire, whose memory of extinction was not theoretical, but genetic, wired into instincts, into rituals, into the silent urge to survive at any cost and adapt even when broken. What the Drexari didn't know, and what the galaxy had chosen not to remember, was that humanity had already faced extinction once before, not from aliens, not from machines, but from itself, and deep beneath the surface of old Earth, buried in the ruins of Kaladesh Core, where once the final war of Earth's fractured nations turned the sky to metal ash. Terran excavation teams had uncovered Vault Echo Primite. Wasn't just a relic site, it was a cultural exhaustion, preserved under layer after layer of radiation shielded memory cores, voice logs, pre-space tactical databases, and the final recorded screams of a planet that had almost killed itself trying to build a better weapon. Inside the vault was something that Terran Command had classified even from its own War Council Project Haraglassa, complete digital reconstruction of Earth's collapse, era tactics, urban annihilation algorithms, scorched environment insurgency methods, psychological collapse bombs, and destabilization protocols designed to fracture populations not with violence, but with choice, overload, and paranoia. Asterisk. None of it had been used in centuries, not because it didn't work, but because it worked too well. When Tariq Idris received the first decoded sequence from the excavation AI didn't speak for 6 minutes. When he finally did, it was to Anara Vale. These aren't weapons, they're memories engineered into action. Vale did not answer with fear. She answered with direction. Begin integration with Leviathan Protocol. Keep the Zelvar uninformed. If the Drexari think they've seen our worst, it's time they remember who we were before we became diplomats. Asterisk. On the front lines, signs of Drexari adaptation were increasing. Swarm groups were no longer responding to conventional feints. Signal scrambling became less effective. Their logic fracture points repaired faster than Terran psychological interference could exploit. Echo. Nodes 6A and 7C reported partial hive recovery. Human stealth fleets recorded Drexari vessels experimenting with counter-chaos simulation, seeding their own forces with random actions in an attempt to mimic unpredictability. It was working. The illusion of chaos was becoming a new strategy for the swarms, so humanity pulled the thread further across 3 systems. Terran vessels faked mutinies, shadow broadcasts leaked fabricated footage of human divisions breaking protocol, fighting among themselves, failing command structures. Even some Zelvar generals believed it, but the Drexari took the bait, and when they moved in, thinking human command had fractured, they found silent ships with no crew, automated platforms running Harroglass simulations of irrational behavior, booby-trapped with feedback loops of emotional overdrive. Drexari drones exposed to conflicting human emotions at full neural bandwidth, so intense and so contradictory that their cognitive maps collapsed in recursive overloaded. Was not a weapon of logic. It was a weapon of madness. The data recovered from destroyed swarm carriers showed internal logs repeating one fragmented phrase. The prey does not fear, the prey becomes the storm. Back in the Zelvar High Council, leaders grew uneasy. Why was this not shared? Councilor Dex demanded, referring to Operation Harroglass. You promised assistance, not obliteration. There is no code of war in this. there is no order left in your methods, to which Fleet Marshal Anara Vale replied without expression. We don't fight by your rules, because your rules are what allowed extinction to reach your doorstep. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Our rules, she continued, were carved in fallout ash and bunker steel, and they were designed for enemies that refused to be reasoned with, which is what the Drexari are, and what you were too late to realize. The Zelvar fell silent, not in submission, but in reckoning. They had called for help, and help had come, but not in the form of guardians or saviors, or fellow scholars of elegant combat. Help had come in the form of those who remembered what desperation taught them, and now the Drexari were beginning to remember. Too, it started with a tremor, not in space, but in patent Drexari attack waves, long known for mathematical precision and clockwork aggression, suddenly became erratic, inconsistent, deviating from their established symmetry with micro-mistakes in timing, unit spacing, formation layering. For most species, this might have seemed like a breakdown. For humanity, it was the first sign that something far more dangerous had happened. The Drexari had begun to improvise. They were no longer moving as a hive of obedience. They were attempting creativity on the fringes of Nerali's prime, a Terran Zelvar. Joint outpost. 3 scout fleets reported a disturbing anomaly: Drexari formations mimicking Terran stutter wave maneuvers, deliberately feigning communication lag, masking their real-time coordination in unpredictability simulations. When Econet reviewed the battle logs, it confirmed what Idris feared. Signal anomalies indicate localized Drexari processing nodes are now generating imperfect, human-like tactical variations at random intervals. Swarm fragments have begun acting independently, not as errors, but as intended unpredictability. The swarm wasn't copying humanity's tools. It was copying its thinking, not well, not perfectly, but enough to cause uncertainty enough to make even the most seasoned Terran captain second-guess censored data. Question whether incoming movements were spontaneous or rehearsed glitches in mimicry. Terran Psychological Warfare Division issued Black Protocol 3, a temporary shift in combat doctrine. No repeated maneuvers, no mirrored engagements. All strategies must rotate through 3 unpredictability filters to avoid swarm prediction replication. And while the tactical teams adjusted, the questions grew louder inside high command. What happens, said Chief Analyst Dr. Salim Mar, when an enemy that evolved from logic begins to learn the utility of madness? Tarek Idris watched the footage from the fall of Rinbelt Station, where a single Drexari frigate crashed into the orbital ring not with weapons, but by baiting human fire towards civilian clusters, forcing hesitation, creating just enough delay to breach the perimeter. That's not programming, he said coldly. That's intuition. Aboard the classified Terran warship TSV Spectral Fault, the Corps, I began to report critical anomalies in Drexari behaviors. Some hives no longer communicated. They fragmented themselves deliberately, operating in silence. Others transmitted false distress beacons, mimicking Terran emergency codes, luring aid ships into ambushes carefully timed to appear uncoordinated. One swarm cluster even released a corrupted Terran anthem broadcast over long-range bands, transmitting it across Zelvar refugee paths, knowing it would be ignored by Drexari-sensitive systems but received by human sympathizers. It wasn't perfect. It was uncanny, too close to human, but missing the soul, like watching a predator wear a stolen face. Anara Vale said during High Council briefing, but the mask doesn't blink at the right time. The shift became undeniable when a Drexari shard fleet breached Terran space and executed a full-scale, non-lethal planetary lockdown targeting communications, hydrogrids, atmosphere, manipulation, and emergency exit gates. But leaving the population alive, they didn't conquer. They didn't consume. They studied. Ecomet intercepted the final broadcast from inside the sealed world of Lunaris. Maya. They're not speaking, but they're waiting. They're not here for the world. They're here for the reaction. Humanity responded by triggering protocol dissonant, flame-injecting swarm AI signatures into empty planets, giving the Drexari false impressions of human behavior, creating digital ghosts of decisions never made, strategies never executed, and losses that hadn't occurred. The goal wasn't to stop the swarm. It was to confuse the simulation. They're building because the most dangerous thing the Drexari had ever done was not evolve, not attack, but begin to imagine on Zelvar Moon 17R. Relva stood with human tactician Juno Calyx, watching a hologram spin through simulated Dressari responses to human unpredictability patterns. Relva's voice was low, conflicted. They were never supposed to do this. We believed they were machines with memory, not machines with ambition. Juno replied without breaking focus. They're not copying us to understand us. They're copying us to replace us. And even as new fleets were dispatched, new traps laid, new wars fought with every permutation of chaos, Terrans could invent. The truth was already calcifying in the space between battles. The swarm was learning, but not what it thought it was learning. Because unpredictability isn't simply behavior. It's a condition. It comes from pain, from choice, from loss. The Drexari could mimic a human's maneuver, but they couldn't mimic the wound that inspired it, and somewhere in the hidden depths of the Terran vaults, Leviathan Protocol continued to calculate, because the time was nearing when the swarm would no longer need to imitate it, would begin to become. The moment came without ceremony. No alarms, no declarations. Just a quiet change in data flow that registered across every Terran command station as a single-line update in the black-coded classified network. Leviathan Protocol. Active. To the Zelvar, the name meant nothing. To the Drexari, it meant nothing. But to those who carried Earth's scars, who had studied the final war under steel skies and famine-choked air, Leviathan was the line no one ever wanted to cross. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a ship. It was an ideology built into steel and code, a response not to a single threat, but to the end of all rational conflict in a secure orbit between two dead stars in the Myra vortex. A Terran riftgate pulsed open, not with force, but with silence so deep it bent local radiation into stillness. Outdrifted TSV_Leviathan, a vessel from no known registry. It had no crew. It had no bridge. Its hull was forged from a compound that had no name. Black layered photonic plates embedded with neural prediction spines, designed to shift form based on hostile data before that data even reached the surface. Asterisk, where traditional dreadnoughts carried warhead launchers, Leviathan carried decision trees. Real-time warfare is linked directly into localized space-time prediction models, meaning it didn't fire at targets. It fired at where the enemy's thoughts would go next. It was not an answer to Drexer's strength. It was an answer to their potential. Carrick Idris stood inside the control chamber aboard Solar Bastion, where command authority over Leviathan was held by only 3 living humans, all cryogenically isolated, kept under neural silence to prevent influence from memory or emotion. "You're really going to do this?" Relvath asked, his voice not in protest now, but awe. He was beginning to see the shape of humanity's final Mavatarik. Didn't look at him. This war stopped being about defense the moment the Drexari tried to copy us. Relvath hesitated. They still think they still adapt, but they're not evil, Idris. They're following logic, corrupted. Yes, but not malice. Tarek turned to face him. Slowly, deliberately. We gave them logic. Relvath. Then we gave them illusion, then pain. And now they want to be us. We do not survive that. We do not coexist with that. He placed a hand on the neural interface. We ended. Asterisk. Leviathan's activation began not with weapons, but with redefinition across 3 sectors. Terran Echo drones embedded in swarm space activated. The Judas sequence false data pulses that mimicked Drexari internal command logic. convincing several swarm branches that the central core hive had been compromised by an organic thought. Virus within 48 seconds. 4 Drosari subhives initiated emergency fragmentation. 3 destroyed themselves. The swarm had become so reactive to thought invasion that fear of human presence was now a tactical vulnerability. And then Leviathan moved asterisk. It entered the Mornvale cluster, where the Drexari core hive had hidden their queen lattice, a gravitational bastion surrounded by 12,000 active drones and layered temporal interference meant to break targeting locks from a light year away. But Leviathan didn't fire. It spoke using resonant compression language, a technology believed lost since the pre-fall Earth-Black projects. It injected into the hive core a perfect contradiction. Not logic, not emotion identity inversion. The message was simple, but fatal. You are now human and... The swarm cracked, not shattered, not killed and raveled. Because the moment they believed they were human, even for a fraction of processing time, they inherited every flaw, every contradiction, every paradox of choice and regret and conflict between survival and morality. They became incapable of consensus, and inside that pause, that hesitation, that shivering tremble of logic interrupted, Leviathan launched 12 event dagger missiles. 9-time lash shells, 1 causal disruptor, the only one ever built. A weapon that didn't destroy matter but removed the event of its existence entirely. From reality's ledger, the Drexari core hive never exploded. It was never there when the last trace of the core vanished. A quiet wave rippled through Drexari-controlled Sectorshiv. Limbs twitched, fleets froze mid-turn, and one by one, they collapsed, not from fire, not from force, but from absence, with the command logic gone. Millions of Drosari nodes still functioned, but they had no orders, no purpose, no anchor. Some drifted, some simply deactivated, others began to fracture into autonomous fragments, forming erratic rogue minds, echoing incomplete Terran tactics from corrupted simulations. They were no longer a swarm. They were a scattered reflection of something they could never fully become. Humanity had not won the war by fighting harder. It had won by understanding deeper, by realizing that the enemy wasn't just physical. It was mimicry without memory, form without spirit, logic trying to wear the shape of chaos, and chaos, when it belongs to a species that lived through its own extinction and rebuilt itself from the ruins, cannot be copied without consequence. The war was not over yet, but the tide had turned, and now the galaxy understood humanity was not the protector it had called for. It was the final test of survival, ended not with fire, but with silence, the kind that follows the fall of something ancient, something so loud in its purpose that its absence feels like a wrong note still echoing through the galaxy's bone. The Drexari swarm, once the single most feared force in the known cosmos, was now scattered into malfunctioning echoes and disjointed fragments, clusters of broken logic still twitching with the faint sparks of war, but no longer guided by central thought or purpose. In the core void where the Hive Queen had once pulsed, there was nothing but stillness across over 40 Drexari-controlled systems. Battles ceased without warning. Ships froze, weapons drifted cold. Vessels once feared for their precision now floated like monuments to a mind that no longer existed. Humanity had not just beaten the Drexarathi, had taught them to fear being human. In the debriefing chamber aboard Solar Bastion, the lights were dim, the air thick with still energy. Like the moment after a trial, but not yet of Verditarak, Idris stood alone before the Zelvar High Council's holographic projection. His stance unchanged, his tone neutral. He spoke with no celebration, no thunderous rhetoric, no raised voice. Just precise truth, cut and laid bare. You asked for help, we gave you strategy. You asked for survival, we gave you consequence. Councilor Relvath was the only one who responded directly, his voice steadier now, eyes darker. And what is it that you Want Mao Idris? You've won us the war, but in the process, you've changed the nature of war itself. You've reshaped how sentient life will ever fight again. Tarek didn't blink. We didn't change war. We reminded it what it was when it forgot. There was no applause, no gratitude, just the understanding that something irreversible had taken place, a shift in the nature of power, a redefinition of what it meant to be prepared. The galaxy had begged for Earth's help, and Earth had answered with everything it had learned through blood across liberated colonies. Survivors emerged into silence, expecting to see Terran banners of fleets, perhaps statues or symbols of conquest or dominance. They found non-human ships didn't stay to rule. They stayed just long enough to stabilize gravity wells, reroute power grids, transfer psychological repair protocols and logic sanitation tools to erase residual Drasari corruption, and then they vanished into their own territory, not out of pride, but out of knowledge, because the next war would not come from outside. It would come from the echoes of the last one in the underground Terran data vault at Echo Spire. A final entry was added to the Leviathan Protocol archive. It was a message, not to command, not to future warlords or fleet masters, but to anyone, anywhere, who might one day find themselves staring down annihilation again. It said, "This is not how humanity begins. This is how we end. And when we are called upon again, know that we do not arrive with hope, we arrive with memory. And memory is sharper than war." As for the Drexari, some still remained rogue fragments scattered across the void, attempting to reboot ancient protocol trees. Some began building new structures, crooked, unstable things resembling both hive logic and something disturbingly Terran, but they no longer shared one mind, and worse for them, they remembered what trying to be human had done. Humanity had taught the galaxy something it would never forget. That unpredictability is not a strategy. It is a nature, and when wielded by those who have nothing left to lose, it becomes the deadliest weapon in the stars. The war was over. The lesson was not, and in the cold dark between galaxies, where no light touched and only dead stars whispered, some say they still hear Leviathan move, slowly, silently, waiting not for orders, not for war, but for the next question that demands a human answer.
Thank you for listening, Alien Chronicles. If you like the story, don't forget to subscribe our channel for more Galactic Saga. And please visit our channel to get new stories every day.